I realized at some point working on this book that I was trying to concoct my own theory of everything. And I'll give you a few minutes summation of the Kaiser theory. Here's a short form. By the time fed-up voters spoke up in 2006 and again in 2008, ending a long Republican era, or era of Republican dominance, Washington was badly broken, a real mess. We've had some change this year, but we still have a mess. It's a mess that took nearly 4 decades to create, and it was a joint effort, a bipartisan effort. Democrats and Republicans contributed. Over the last 40 years, I argue, our politics has really been transformed. It was a complex process, but its essence is pretty easy to describe. Television and money changed everything. Television is shorthand. It covers the new technologies that came into use in American politics starting in the 60s. By the 80s, focus groups, pollsters, 1-minute TV commercials, 30-second TV commercials, high-paid consultants, slick direct mail, all this had taken over our campaigns. The commercials and the ads and the direct mail campaigns were often based on the findings of the pollsters. Pollsters often, in many campaigns, became more important than the candidates themselves. I found a wonderful political science study. It's 1989. Several professors surveyed dozens of political consultants and asked them what role the candidates they worked for actually played in the elections that they helped, election campaigns that they'd helped to run. 44% of these campaign consultants said that the candidate had left it entirely to them to decide what issues to emphasize in their campaign. 2/3 of these consultants said that the candidate they worked for had left all tactical decisions to them, to the consultants. 20 years ago, when I was the national news editor of the Post, we did a project on the new technologies of politics and the impact that they were having. And David Broder, my wonderful colleague, still writing his column at the age of 80, went over to talk to Doug Bailey, a very smart, talented, moderate Republican political consultant, famous to political journalists and political junkies as the co-author of the commercials made for Gerald Ford in 1976, which almost beat Jimmy Carter. We've forgotten how close that election turned out to be in the end, and it was in no small measure because of this very shrewd TV campaign that Bailey and his partner Chuck Deerdorf created for Gerald Ford. Broder asked him, Doug, what does this new technology really mean? And he gave him a wonderful quotation, which I've now used in 2 books and many speeches, which I'm going to read to you. Doug Bailey, 1988. Quote, "The biggest problem is that it's no longer necessary for a political candidate to guess what his audience may think. He can find out with a nightly tracking poll. So it's no longer likely that political leaders are going to lead. Instead, they are going to follow." Think about that. Political leaders won't lead, they will follow public opinion. Absolutely prescient. Bailey was describing, I think, the dawning of the age of pandering, an age that everybody in this room has lived through for quite a long time. It's my argument in the book that this phenomenon of turning the campaign over to the experts, to the consultants and the pollsters, has actually had a big effect on who runs, who wants to be a member. I don't think that the John Bradamuses, Rhodes Scholars and so on, the cream of the crop, is half as likely now to want to be a member of the House or Senate as they were in the past. Who wants to be the person who follows somebody else's, some expert's advice on what issues to emphasize, what to talk about in your campaign. Who wants to rely on 30-second TV spots as the main vehicle of communication with voters? A lot of interesting people, quite a few very smart people, but it's not the kinds of statesmen and women that I think some of us, certainly I would prefer to have in the Congress. And of course, in conjunction with all these new technologies, the cost of our campaigns skyrocketed. Do you remember the cost of your 1980 campaign? Do you remember how much you had to spend? It was well less than $500,000. It probably was only $200,000 or $300,000. The average cost of a winning campaign for the Senate in 1974, 2 years before Carter's election, the average winning Senate campaign cost $450,000. That would be about $1.3 million in today's dollars, adjusting for inflation. Last November in 2008, the average winning Senate campaign, we don't have the final figures yet, but it was more than $10 million, from $450,000 to $10 million, or 1.3 to 10. And even in states, modest, medium-sized states, North Carolina, Minnesota, Oregon, the competing candidates spent in each of those three more than $40 million running for the Senate. Money became more and more important in other ways, too. People here in my hometown started to get rich, people like Jerry Cassidy. And here's why, I argue. John mentioned this. The federal government, the reach of the federal government grew and grew. At some point, people started to realize that decisions made in this town were having a bigger and bigger impact on their own livelihoods, either as individuals or as representatives of companies, institutions, whatever. The size of the government did grow dramatically. The reach of the decisions grew too. Corporations began to realize how important things decided in Washington could be for them. We had a huge boom in the trade associations and corporate offices business in Washington. When I was a young reporter in the 60s, there were very few such offices here. Most were in Chicago and New York. Now they're all here, and of course there are many, many more than there ever used to be. Interest groups got organized, interest groups of all kinds, and they began lobbying the government for preferences, for privileges, for laws that helped them improve their lot. And they hired, of course, and created lobbyists who became a new class of influential and wealthy Washingtonians. Before long, I think, members of Congress and senior government officials began to envy the fancy big houses in McLean and Potomac that these new lobbyists, this new class of lobbyists occupied. Their country houses, their houses on the Eastern Shore or at Bethany Beach or Rehoboth, and their fat paychecks, of course. Over time, thousands of government officials, really thousands, more than 10,000 ultimately, according to the Center for Responsive Politics, passed through what has come to be known as the revolving door, left public service and became lobbyists themselves. There are nearly 200 former members of Congress now registered to lobby. Cashing in on your public service for private gain became commonplace, and Washington began to take it for granted. Tom Daschle, I think, was a very revealing case in point. Some of you may have shared my surprise to discover what Daschle had done after he was defeated for re-election. Facts that came out early this year when he was forced to withdraw as a candidate to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Tom Daschle, liberal Democrat, famous good guy, had accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars in fat speaking fees from the health and related industries that he proposed to become an important regulator of as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. He was earning $1 million a year as a strategic advisor for a big law firm in Washington. He did not register as a lobbyist, But neither did Clark Clifford ever register as a lobbyist. Neither did Tommy Corcoran, the famous Tommy the Cork, because they weren't going up to the Hill asking people to vote this way or that on a bill, they said. That's what you have to do to be required to register as a lobbyist. They were giving strategic advice. A nice Washington term. This is what Daschle was doing. And it was very disappointing, I know, to many of Daschle's old supporters and friends to discover just the degree to which he had indeed cashed in. But this infected the whole system. I came to know many young people during my reporting year who actually had gone to work on Capitol Hill to punch the ticket, to work for a couple of years in some member's office, so that they could come downtown, as it's known, down to K Street to sign up as lobbyists. In my reporting, I went to Robert Strauss, a remarkable Washington figure, a very successful lobbyist himself, and to ask him to explain to me why the lobbying business had gotten so big. Mr. Strauss is old and frail. He's still now, and was when I spoke to him, confined to a wheelchair, but he's sharp as ever. And he thought about my question for a minute, and he said, "I'll tell you why." He said, "There's just so damn much money in it." Well, when he spoke those words, I knew I had the title for my book, but I think I also had an explanation for what had happened. Lobbyists, of course, needed friends in Congress to win access and favors for their clients. Members of Congress, as I've described, needed money to run for re-election. The rest is history, some of it quite notorious history. One of my favorite quotes in this book is from a Washington public relations man named Dale Lieback, who once briefly worked for Gerald Cassidy. He was a very successful guy today and a very bright fellow. And he explained this to me. I think of it as Lieback's iron law. Quote, "The Hill can't exist without downtown." Translation, Congress can't exist without the lobbyists. And downtown can't exist without the Hill. It's the largest, most democratic bazaar in the world. And it's all about money, going in both directions. In that bazaar, I argue, Congress got the habit of doing favors to win friends and supporters. Favors often in the form of appropriated funds. Over time, it became commonplace for members of Congress to swap their votes on contentious issues for some benefit for their constituents or their supporters. I think those benefits were often payoffs, really. They were the earmarks that John McCain ran against so fervently last year. Mr. Cassidy, my chief character, was one of the inventors of the modern earmark, which I define as an allocation of federal funds to an institution or enterprise for a specific, narrow purpose, not proposed by any government agency, but most often proposed by the recipient itself. Cassidy got really rich in the 80s and 90s by teaching members of Congress and presidents of colleges and heads of big universities and hospitals how to create these earmarks and make everybody happy. And that, of course, is what they do. What is a congressman's greatest satisfaction professionally? Bringing home the bacon. What's the bacon? Often a good earmark. We know what happened. When the Republicans gained control of the Congress in 1995, they turned earmarks into a principal tool to stay in power. I got some wonderful stuff in the book from Bob Livingston, who was Newt Gingrich's chosen chairman of the Appropriations Committee in the House, who is now a very fancy and well-paid lobbyist himself. But Livingston